Just all right. We are beginning. Welcome. I'm Marty Perry. I'm so happy to see some new faces, as well as the returning attendees. We welcome you on this beautiful summer evening for our summer read, The Church of Our Granddaughters, by our chair, Carrie Frederick Frost. Tonight, of course, we cover chapter 3. But not to worry if you missed chapters 1 and 2. They are on our website, on Facebook and Instagram. So catch up with that because this has been a great series and it continues through July. So we are gathered tonight to discuss the third chapter that I'm sure everybody's read, and if not, it is Churching, a rite of hospitality and blessing for mother and child. Our speaker tonight is Father Stelyios Muksuris, and he is summarizing this chapter for us and offering his prepared discussion questions. So please stay with us to the very end. We'll have a breakout session after his presentation, and each week it's been wonderful. And we're getting to know one another, hear from one another, see where we are in our lives and our parishes, and how we're living out our Orthodox faith. So stay for the end to that. All right. We have so many people coming in, so I'm going to wait just 1 second. Barbara, our IT board member tonight, is going to put up the St. Phoebe prayer. We like to begin all of these Zooms with this beautiful prayer, and we hope that you'll take just a moment to settle in and let's read this prayer together. Most Holy Phoebe, who was found to be worthy of the diaconate and was Paul's helper and carried his words to the people of Rome, who is called the lamp of Cenchrea, we now humbly ask that you intercede for us and pray to Christ our God for us as we discern his will for the revival of the ordained female diaconate and for the upbuilding of the entire church today. Pray for us, St. Phoebe, that we will be blessed and fruitful in all our works tonight and always. To God's glory. Amen. All right, welcome everyone. It's just coming in now. We're happy you're here. You've arrived at the right time. We have Father Stelyios Muksuris with us tonight. He is a new board member. We are really excited to have him. He is a lifelong Orthodox Christian, born in Constantinople. Think about that. Professor and chair of liturgy, sacramental theology, and languages at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary in Pittsburgh. He has authored many books and is also a member of the GOA Synodal Commission on Liturgical Texts. And if all of that does not keep him busy, he also, in his spare time, likes to read, walk, and play the bouzouki. Father, is that the Greek lute, the three-string thing?
Yeah, 8 strings. Yes,
Eight
that's right.
strings. Oh my, not the Irish four strings. Those are
Uh,
wonderful.
it's four couplets, so 8 strings altogether.
Wow. Very exciting. Well, we are happy to have you. And Father, God bless you as you lead us through this presentation tonight. And we are just praying for you as God leads you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marty, and good evening and welcome to everyone once again. I'm happy to be with you this evening and to speak on the rite of churching. Um, so, to begin with, I'd like to go through some linguistic considerations and some non-Orthodox practices regarding churching that I think will pique everyone's interest. In addition to summarizing Carrie's amazing chapter on churching, I'd also like to add in some of my own research in this area as a liturgiologist. serving the Orthodox Church in the Academy. So the rite of churching, in colloquial Greek, churching is known as ekklesiasmos from the word ekklesia meaning church, or sarandismos or sarandisi from the modern Greek saranda meaning 40, and referring to the 40 days following an infant's birth. The formal name of this rite, interestingly, has many variations, ranging from prayers for a woman in childbed on the 40th day to prayers for the churching of the child after 40 days, to prayers for the churching of the mother and child after the completion of the 40 days from birth. The variations in the ceremonial titles not only reflect the emphasis or focus of the ceremonial prayers, the mother, the child, and the 40 days, but also indicate the period in the church's liturgical history when these prayers were composed. Now, one may think that when we talk about the rite of churching, we are specifying a ceremonial action common to the Orthodox Church or more broadly to Eastern Rite churches. But this is not the case. In Latin, for example, this rite is known as the benedictio mulieris postpartum, meaning the blessing of a woman after giving birth. This rite has existed and continues to exist in the Roman Catholic Church, but the rite fell into disuse after Vatican II in the late 1960s, although traditional Catholics still adhere to the old rite of blessing and thanksgiving. In the Lutheran Church, churchings were also common, being celebrated after the offering of Holy Communion. In the Anglican Church's Book of Common Prayer, the churching of women is likewise celebrated publicly as a celebratory rite for new life. In the US-based Episcopal Church, the churching of women is a liturgy for the purification or churching of women after giving birth. The rite is designated for public celebration on a Sunday after the intercessions and before communion when offered, very soon after the birth or adoption of a child. Most notably, the 1979 Book of Common Prayer removed all prior language of ritual impurity. The older rite was replaced with the service called a thanksgiving for the birth or adoption of a child. And in the Methodist rite, the rubrics call for a child to be presented to the congregation by the family to give thanks to God for new life. So, as you can see, it is not just an Orthodox or Eastern ritual, but is actually very present in many of the other Western churches as well. Now, in her book, Carey rightly calls churching a rite, and I quote, a rite of hospitality and blessing that should no longer contain any theologically poor, pastorally harmful, and unchristian connections between birth and purity, end quote. We can surmise that what can unchristianize anything that is presumably Christian is untrue belief and harmful practice, the very opposite of who God is as ultimate truth, the God who is simultaneously the epitome and source of love and mercy. For those Orthodox couples blessed to have children and who seek the solace of Christ's church on earth, the language they wish to hear is one of joyfulness and celebration. For as Carey notes, the nuptial prayers from the mystery of holy matrimony have been answered. Sadly, in many places that adhere to prayer books and evchologia that have not been scrutinized and corrected for their textual content and rubrics, a mother and her family are often subjected to deprecatory language upon returning to their church. Liturgical texts that refer to a mother who has given birth as defiled, filthy, and in need of purification essentially debase her almost to the level of a criminal whose and I'm sarcastic here, whose great sin or offense against God is quite peculiarly obeying the divine mandate from Scripture to be fruitful and multiply, and not one of a moral or ethical character. As was made evident in chapter 2 on menstruation in Carey's book, the religious castigation and censure for a God-given natural life process is outrightly nonsensical and unacceptable. The late 4th century Syrian church order, the Apostolic Constitutions, is characteristic and clear on this matter, as are Saint Pope Gregory the Great, the dialogist, and other prominent church authorities. In Apostolic Constitutions, this 4th century document, we read the following, quote, "For neither lawful mixture, intercourse, nor childbearing, nor the menstrual purgation, nor nocturnal pollution can defile the nature of man, or separate the Holy Spirit from him. Nothing but piety and unlawful practice can do that. For the Holy Spirit always abides with those that are possessed of it, so long as they are worthy." End of quote. It is abundantly clear that the development of liturgical practice in the ancient church often drew on Judaic practices. Not only did Christian liturgical rites mimic their Jewish forebears rubrically, but they also inherited much of the ritualistic language and mindset, which was neither always cordial nor accommodating. The 40-day churching rite is a Jewish purification rite drawn from Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 7, and certainly one to which the Theotokos and Christ were subject themselves as faithful Jews. Now, this condemnatory language is not only grossly inconsistent, as Carey points out, with the joyfulness that a couple is riding from their wedding into childbirth, but it is also inexcusably incompatible with the orthodox theological anthropology outlined in the first chapter of our book. As Carey notes, quote, "There is a profound mismatch between the denigration of the female body present in churching and the Orthodox Church's teaching on the incarnation, the human body, the value of maternity, and human life in the womb and childbirth." End of quote. Thus, bad practice that reflects bad theology and bad theology that fuels bad practice does nothing less than unchristianize the experience of a prominent moment of worship in a family's life. To quote the late Father Alexander Schmemann in his book of Water and the Spirit, "A decadent liturgy supported by a decadent theology and leading to a decadent piety. Such is the sad situation in which we find ourselves today, and which must be corrected if we love the Church and want her to become again the power which transforms the life of human beings." End of quote. It is true that in the Church's manuscript tradition, the extant sources available to us that speak about churching, like the oldest Byzantine Evchologion from the 8th century, the Barberini Codex 336, focus only on the child. There is no mention made of the mother whatsoever. As such, in the Church's consciousness, the 40-day churching is understood as a pre-baptismal rite for the baby, following the first day prayers and the child's naming on the 8th day. The child is made a peripheral member of the church, a catechumen of sorts, if you will, in preparation for their baptism. The modern rite consists of 2 couplets of prayers for a total of 4 prayers. The last couplet, what we would call prayers 3 and 4, these prayers are the most ancient and both focus exclusively on the child, focusing on the joyfulness of new life and anticipating the child's baptism. But by the 12th century, the first couplet that specifically addresses the mother appears. And it is these prayers, prayers 1 and 2, that use deprecatory language toward the mother, largely reminiscent of the Levitical code. These are, as I mentioned, today's prayers 1 and 2, with the amended references regarding the child, and bless this child also, etc., if the child survived the birth. So the million-dollar question is, why this shift? I have some thoughts about this. Within the Byzantine East, the victory over iconoclasm and the prominent Studite liturgical forms of the middle to the late 9th century, largely achieved, mind you, by the monks and celibate clergy of the church, paved the way for the monastic ranks to assume control of the church's liturgical traditions, customs, hymnology, and theology. This meant that monks were now charged with composing many of the prayers, with the intent to align Christian rites with historical biblical events. Consequently, the interpretation of these events likewise drew on Old Testament theological concepts without any or very minimal, if any, consideration of the church's theological anthropology that Carrie explains so vividly and so well in the first chapter of her book. All but forgotten was the pronouncement that Christ has supplanted the curse of the law through his own death and has fulfilled it, restoring all of humanity, woman and man, to the fullness of their inherent image and likeness in God. This liturgical overhaul or monasticization of the church's worship was accompanied by other factors, such as a further male clericalization in the Byzantine Church by priest monks and bishops. Exactitude in liturgical celebrations and attention to ritual detail and purity by male clergy led to the need for altar-related purification, thus leading to the decline of the order of the female diaconate in the East, as Carey says, quote, partly on the premise that the putative impurity of menstruation excludes women from the altar, end of quote. Inherent also in this mindset was the development of a sin-focused and body-denying emphasis, a return to Neoplatonic and Gnostic tendencies. Now, following the prayers read at the beginning of the rite, the service of churching concludes with a ritual act involving the child's entrance, or not, into the holy altar. Liturgically, this action is an imitation of St. Simeon's encounter and reception of the infant Jesus into his arms in the Jerusalem temple. In the church, it is essentially a dedication service whereby all children, and not just firstborn males as in the Mosaic law, are dedicated to God. A complex and dubious history, however, accompanies this part of the service. Again, the rubrics regarding the entrance of a child into the sanctuary originate in the late Middle Ages of Byzantium and well after the first prayers for the child appeared in Barberini in the 8th century. The manuscript tradition regarding this ritual practice varies. As Carey observes, there are practices that include both sexes being carried around the altar, neither sex being carried around the altar, and only males being carried around the altar. Practically, however, all the earliest manuscripts witness to the fact that all children were carried into the holy altar regardless of gender. In fact, there is a phrase in Greek, adiakritos philou, unconcerned with gender. The one exception among the manuscripts that we encounter is in the early 15th century manuscript known as Sinai 968, which states that only males are brought into the altar. Similarly, Saint Simeon of Thessaloniki, who died in 1429, around the time when Sinai 968 was written, Saint Simeon was the last great liturgical commentator of the Byzantine Church. He indicates that even after baptism, the child is still dedicated to God and offers his or her first act of worship as an Orthodox Christian. So the churching may even be applied after a baptism has taken place, although it's always preferential for it to precede the baptism, since a catechumen is made during this rite. In a variation for both sexes, females were carried around the three sides of the altar, meaning the right, the back, and the left as you're facing the altar, but never in front of the holy table, whereas males were carried also in front of the holy table, and the dismissal was done at the solea. Another fun fact is that Simeon believed that the churching rite produced a catechumen out of the infant. So ideally, in terms of sequence, the churching prayers were read at the baptism, the day of baptism, usually following the exorcism and catechism portion, and before the baptism proper. Now, moving on, Carey makes an insightful observation regarding the language of forgiveness in the prayers for the mother. She writes, quote, "There is inherent wisdom and sense in giving a woman a blessing to stay home after childbirth because this is a time when rest and recovery are needed. It is also unique and helpful in Orthodox practice that the language around forgiveness and churching can be understood as sanction for the woman to return to the Eucharist without going to confession first." End of quote. She immediately adds that typically any long absence, for whatever reason, from communion would necessitate confession before approaching the chalice. Churching, in a sense, bypasses, as it were, this requirement, and for good reason. However, this intentional absence from the Eucharistic life of the Church necessitates the forgiveness language, not because of impurity, but because of the possibility of accumulating sins or moral wrongdoings during one's absence from the Church's liturgical life, which can apply to anyone for that matter. In addition, one may regard the rite of churching as a rectification of an important canon of the Church regarding excommunication. And I'm referring here to Canon 80 of the Penthecti Ecumenical Council in the late 7th century, which mandates the deposition of clerics or the excommunication of lay people who fail to attend the divine liturgy for 3 consecutive Sundays without a valid reason. However, while this canon has in mind those individuals who either recklessly or ignorantly avoid the sacramental life of the Church due to negligence or simply a secularly minded disposition, there is nothing reckless or sinful that a new mother has done when fulfilling the will of God to warrant the language of excommunication and personal debasement. Words matter, and words must be consistent to maintain the theological accuracy and propriety the Church must have at all times. Carey concludes this chapter by pointing out the desperate efforts of parochial clergy and individual hierarchs to soften the condemnatory language inherent in the prayers, as well as to find arbitrary and often poor explanations for the abuses of simply bad liturgy. While cognizant of the dilemma, many well-intentioned and empathetic clergy take it upon themselves to right the wrongs of the past by making changes on the fly. However, this is not enough, and it can even amount to a dangerous solution. The problem, I would argue, as a liturgiologist, is systemic. In other words, liturgical renewal must not be done in individual camps and solely by priests. It must be standardized for the entire church, by the entire church. And most importantly, as Carrie points out, women, who are clearly the focus of this rite, must, without exception, be the vital part of the decision-making process regarding the rite of churching in the Orthodox Church. It is utterly, in my opinion, foolhardy to have the content and rubrics of a rite for a family dictated by celibate men, regardless, with all due respect, of their advancement in the spiritual life, monks and bishops, from a particular epoch in the Church's liturgical history. I've written elsewhere that the time has come for the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox scholarly world, the Academy, to cease traveling opposite each other on perfectly parallel lines. Their work, our work, must intersect. Carey rightly argues, and very eloquently so, quote, "Yet it would be most appropriate for theologically trained women who have given birth and then walked back through the narthex doors to rejoin their community with an infant in their arms to recraft the churching prayers, which would then be adopted by bishops." This is not to suggest that the Orthodox Church's male clergy have nothing to offer new mothers, but it is to say that it is fitting for mothers to pen these prayers, given their history and given the fact that mothers understand what the postpartum time period is like in a way that the male clergy simply cannot, no matter how sympathetic, well-intentioned, or pastorally gifted. The matter of the postpartum rites is unambiguous. Impurity is not part of the Church's understanding of childbirth or women's bodies. These rites could be replaced or altered by all jurisdictions with relative ease and with the willing assistance of Orthodox mothers. Orthodox synods could easily call upon women, mother scholars, to craft new churching rites and then distribute them, end quote. The suggestion is most welcome precisely because it is inclusive and sensible. I would only offer that this work of textual and rubrical revision is achieved in collaboration with other liturgiologists, men or women, who are willing to work with female scholars, mothers, hierarchs, and synods. The presence of liturgical scholars on such a committee is imperative in order to keep the dialogue and results real, relevant, and within the creative liturgical tradition of the Church. In fact, I would even offer myself to this task as a member of the GOA Synod on liturgical texts, and as of now, the proposed editor and stylist for all future liturgical publications of our archdiocese. A subcommittee of the Synod could easily be formed and begin this collaboration that would only enhance the liturgical witness of the Church and bring the Church's liturgical practice to correspond more closely to her proper theological anthropology. The language in the prayers for the mother need not simply be softened, but changed altogether to reflect a rite of hospitality that celebrates not only the miracle of life, but the grandeur of womanhood and motherhood. Forgiveness of sins possibly committed before communion, as with confession, is for one's justified and necessary absence from the Church's Eucharistic life. In a lecture I gave almost 2 years ago to the metropolis of Pittsburgh clergy during a retreat at the Holy Protection Women's Monastery in the Poconos, I made several additional suggestions which I would like to share with all of you now. First, regarding the rubric of infants entering the altar. In keeping with the overwhelming evidence from the manuscripts, all children, regardless of sex, should be carried into the altar, Since no child is ever denied baptism, and therefore no child is ever denied becoming a catechumen prior to baptism. The entrance would be through the south deacon's door and to the south, east, and north of the holy table, but not the front, and then out through the north deacon's door with the dismissal done in the front of the church or the solea. With regard to the insertion of the churching rite during public worship, I admit that perhaps the appropriate place should be during Vespers, the evening before, or at the end of Matins, or hours before the beginning of the Divine Liturgy. This naturally implies the presence of other worshippers from the community. Another option I have thought about is during the Divine Liturgy, before communion, in the presence of the entire community. This would allow the full Eucharistic community to welcome the family back to the church and to meet the churched child. It would also allow the family to receive communion together as the seal of their and the community's celebration and thanksgiving for the celebration of new life and the combination of blessed motherhood and fatherhood. And speaking of fathers, I have another important suggestion. Hardly any mention is made of the father of the child in the churching rite. The dependency of the rite on its Levitical prototype and its castigation of women for the sake of maintaining ritual purity betrays the very notion of moral sin as belonging to all genders. The father in the rite seems to be let off scot-free. If the father is to assist his wife during her healing and rest on the weekends, and does not attend the Divine Liturgy himself, again for valid reasons, then the prayer of forgiveness and welcome should be extended to cover his own moral sins as well, bypassing the need for confession as in the case of the mother. In fact, the parents return to their worshiping community and they are honored for their joint parenthood, which the church celebrates. And what more beautiful act is there than to receive Holy Communion together as a unit, as they introduce their child as a peripheral member of the church, now preparing for holy baptism. Additionally, the prayer can also incorporate a petition for the godparents to be, above and beyond what currently exists, which is just a fleeting reference, especially if these godparents were the sponsors at the parents' wedding. This reimagining of the rite would ensure a welcome and logical continuity between the wedding and the birth of children, and it would ensure that a sound theology pervades the sacraments that mark the human circle of life. In conclusion, in order to remain faithful to our fundamental Orthodox theology and anthropology, and to truly minister to the mother and to the father and to the child with Christ-like sensitivity and love, reimagining the rite of churching may necessitate not only perhaps a substantial overhaul of the ritual, but the creation of several forms of the rite conducive to the conditions or settings in which people find themselves. This would include, but would not be limited to, for example, a rite for parents adopting a child, a rite for a non-Orthodox parent, a rite for when both parents are Orthodox, the situating of a rite during a divine liturgy, and another rite during a non-Eucharistic service, and even a rite of churching held before a baptism, as St. Simeon suggests, or on the a rite of churching held before a baptism, which is the current practice, or even on the same day as a baptism, which is what Simeon suggests. Ultimately, and I close with this thought, to be in creative continuity with the revered past means to be open to the whisperings and guidance of the Holy Spirit as he leads us through meaningful theology and meaningful liturgy that reflects it. The dignity of every human being created in God's image and likeness is preserved in every rite of the Orthodox Church. The pre-baptismal rites, and most especially The 40-day churching of the family and the child should never, ever have to be an exception. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Father Stell. Um, we need to take a moment to let this sink in. Before we take your Father Stell's prepared questions and break out into groups, um, Father Stell will, or I'm sorry, Father Stell's questions. Can you bring those questions up, Barbara? Or do you want to do this first? Yeah, here we go. Um, Before we do this, if there are any questions for Father Stell right now, any concerns that you have or um, clarifications, questions only, we could take a few minutes. You'd need to raise your hand with the reaction button. I mean, we will limit this because we do want to break out into our groups. But if there's something that really is in your mind and it's a question but not a comment, we'll save the comments for the breakout groups. But if you have a clarification that needs to be made, let's take a minute and see if we can accept some questions. Um, Barbara, you're prepared for that? Okay, good. So let's give people time. This was great and deep and wide. So it we need to let it land for a moment. Do you see any hands raised? Maria? Yes. Do you want to unmute? Just give us one moment. There you
Yes.
go. All right. Questions?
Um,
Mhm.
yes, Father, thank you so very much for your presentation. Um, and I wanted to ask, and this might be a naive question, if indeed this issue is as widespread as it is, and that so much of the impurity part of a woman is in many, many Orthodox churches. Why does the patriarch not come out and say very clearly, this is not Orthodox practice. It's not based in any theological um, um, practice at all, meaning at all in our church, in our Orthodox church, and it needs to cease and desist. Wouldn't that be the easiest thing to do?
Maria, thank you so much for your question. I'll try to be very brief so we can allow us to break into groups. Um, I think the way I would answer that would seem to be the logical approach, or at least to have a synod. But in Orthodoxy, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's a wide gamut of thinking, conservatively, moderately, or liberally about different things. And so, sadly, I believe with hierarchy, there is always an attempt to speak the truth, but also remaining politically correct because they also have to deal with the wide difference of opinion between themselves and other brother hierarchs. So it would seem, and kind of what I said in my presentation is how important it is for the church. And by the church, I don't mean just the Greek jurisdiction or the Antiochian or the Ukrainian jurisdiction. I mean for all of the jurisdictions of orthodoxy to come together. And before coming together as hierarchs, they must come together with us, with the academy, first and foremost, so that they can listen and kind of let this thinking land within their minds and hearts. And there must be a collaboration with the academy so that we can inform them, as Father Taft used to say, not we don't reform, they are in charge of reforming, leading the reform within the Orthodox Church, but they must first be informed and informed responsibly and well. And again, not just by, you know, liturgists, but by women, because this is predominantly a woman-focused issue. So it's a complicated issue, but it's not insurmountable. It's an issue of getting all of Orthodoxy together, and before they come together as hierarchs, they come to us first. And by us, meaning all of you, women and scholars of liturgy, so that we can have this dialogue and make it fruitful before decisions are made.
Great. Any other clarifications, questions for Father Stell?
There are some questions in the chat.
All right. Do you want to read those, Barbara? I did not seeing that.
I can go ahead if you want, unless
Yes.
you
Yes.
see them, Barbara. Okay.
Oh.
One person is wondering if this is controversial and who opposes it. I think Father Stell sort of alluded to that. But there's another one also that says, what does a liturgical change process take? How would we make this change?
Sure. So for liturgical change to happen, it's certainly something that doesn't happen overnight. It is a very long process of collecting information, establishing context, and then making presentations, dialoguing, and then ultimately hierarchs within our church are charged with making the final decision. However, and just to kind of follow up, I see my good friend Valerie makes a very important point that I completely agree with, and that is, it is true that the hierarchs of our church, they need to hear a lot from the grassroots level. They hear a few things, and perhaps, and they take the stuff that they like. They don't listen to the stuff they don't like. And thus, we don't have a full picture of the change that is to be made. So there has to be a much deeper and extended level of dialogue where and again, what Carrie mentions in her book, let's go back to what she suggests. Women have to be allowed into these synod meetings. I mean, scholars need to be allowed into these synod meetings and not just to have committees and report to a leader, and then the leader reports, who happens to be a clergyman, reports to the synod. No, women and scholars need to be part of this dialogue on the deepest level possible. Otherwise, we're just going to be running around in circles, and it's not going to end. And so that's how liturgical change happens. The way liturgical change has happened historically, and I'll just end with this, is that a few voices were heard. Ultimately, bishops make the decision. The decision becomes, because there's no opposition necessarily to it. If you're opposed to something, you become a schismatic. If you're not opposed to it, then you're with the church. The next thing you know is you're basically making policy. And then after centuries go by, without any kind of critiquing of what's happened, it just becomes the policy of the church. That's exactly what happened with churching. And now we are speaking up, and we realize that, there has to be an overhaul of this particular rite that speaks to the proper Orthodox theological anthropology that Carrie has so incredibly expressed so well in her book. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, ladies, and I guess a few gentlemen. But we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah. All right, we are going to move ahead toward our breakout groups. So Barbara is going to read our guidelines for our community for this evening.
The St. Phoebe Center seeks to promote respectful and reasonable discussion about once again ordaining women to the diaconate in the Orthodox Church and specifically tonight's topic of the churching ritual for both mother and child. We expect that all participants, both panelists and attendees, will treat each other with the highest regard, acknowledging that we are all children of God, and will engage with the topic at hand and refrain from personal criticism. We ask that if a specific example of an incident in the life of the church is offered, that any identifying remarks of people involved, or if of a personal story of others involved, be withheld so that we may discuss these issues generally and with respect for privacy. Participants who engage in personal attacks or otherwise denigrate the conversation will not be welcome at our events. Finally, we encourage your curious, robust, and respectful engagement with the work of the St. Phoebe Center. At this time, before we go into breakout groups, we are going to show on the slides the questions, and we will read them, and we ask that you make notes if you don't mind, please.
All right, I'm going to jump in with this. The first question Father has for us is additional prayers for the mother centuries later include impurity language, highly denigrating toward the mother and all women. Here is the question. Could yet another revision, perhaps in the 21st century, aside from correcting the inaccurate and offensive language, add petitions for the father of the child and possibly the godparents? He goes on to say, what would or should these petitions look like? And what kind of language would you like to see in the newly revised rite, consistent with Chapter 1's focus on the theological anthropology rooted in the Incarnation? He goes on to ask, do you think the churching should be celebrated publicly or before the entire congregation? Where in the Divine Liturgy could it be inserted? Could the celebration be extended into our local community's coffee hour? And what would that look like, this liturgical act of celebration that is about hospitality and the Eucharistic assembly? All right, let's see what else. He says here, the pre-baptismal rite of churching in need of further study and revision. Is the entrance or not of all infants into the altar, regardless of sex? This is the question, depending on how it's done. What message does this simple liturgical act convey to the parents of the child? What does it say to the local parish community and to the church at large? All right, some good jumping off places here. Stay with us as Barbara starts to organize our groups. We will ask that each leader of each group get someone to take some notes, a scribe of sorts, because we'll come together after about 25 minutes and those note takers will tell us what their group came up with briefly, and we'll finish off our evening after that. Barbara?
So before we break into groups, once again, I want to reiterate what Marty said. We're going to have about 30 minutes for discussion, and then we'll all come back together, and your scribe will represent your group with the things that you talked about. And at that time, if we have time, we will have we'll open up for a few other questions if there's time. We ask that you turn your camera on. I notice a number of you have your cameras off, so please turn your camera on. Again, designate a scribe for each group. And when you're speaking, please remember to unmute yourself. There will be 3 discussion groups. One will be led by Father Stel, one by Marty, and one by myself. So
our note takers will begin in just a minute or two. What a good night. The community coming together with just so much energy. It's wonderful. What an encouragement.
Estelle, did you assign somebody as note taker? Because in case you didn't, I took notes.
Oh, all right. Good. A lot of
Oops,
notes.
thank you, Val.
All right. Are we all
I don't
back,
think I
Last
did.
week I
Barbara?
forgot until halfway through, and I ended up sending a private note to Marty asking if she would do it. So I thought I'd return the favor.
Are we all back to our gathering, Barbara?
Yes, sorry, I
Oh,
muted myself and went to the end of the line.
all right. So let's see my group. Eleni, are you there? Would you like to be our number one and share with yeah, thank you.
Sure, just forgive me if I get anyone's thoughts wrong, or this will be more stream of consciousness as I
That's
wrote.
great. That's fine.
So started off on a really interesting point. Father Stelios, you mentioned Saint Simeon of Thessaloniki, and one of our members noticed a correlation. He's also the first one to refer to Holy Unction as healing more than just illness of the body, but also the soul. And by doing so, it implies that illness can be a consequence of sin. And so there was a question really about, does this kind of align? We have a biological process being denigrated with sin. And similarly, at the same time, we're, considering whether the biological process of having a child is making someone unclean. So really interesting time in history there was, and that connection. We did have some mentions about the church service itself of churching is beautiful, despite these references to kind of uncleanliness and things like that. And so, there's definitely an appreciation for the idea of churching. But interesting how the Orthodox Church holds motherhood in such high esteem that it seems contradictory that we have these references, these negative references in the churching service. So definitely would like to see us move away from words like impurity, defilement, unclean. Really take under consideration how much more we know now that we didn't know centuries ago about things like postpartum, and that we acknowledge that and the time it takes for that, and that it isn't necessarily 40 days later a woman is back to normal, kind of a thing. And even one suggested maybe we repeat the prayers after a year, when women are still dealing with the physical and psychological recuperation. Definitely like to see acknowledgement of the father, because and how that speaks to the necessity of the role of both parents and the equal, sharing of the role. But we're acknowledging that we as women are feeling very hurt by these different processions through the altar for boys and for girls, and what that implies about us, and that we have a different relationship with God, a less worthy relationship with God somehow. As far as whether or not churching should be public or private, there was, some different experiences with that. One suggestion was, could we make it up to the mother so that they have the choice there? Other discussion about how well it has gone at some churches to move it earlier to the liturgy, and almost kind of ironic if we're welcoming the woman back to the church, but we wait till the liturgy is over to welcome her back and she can't even participate. So I thought that was a really interesting catch there. There was reference to, there's an expression in Greek I'm going to throw in here, new priests, new gospels, right? And how you get a new priest and people have experienced different services. So their first priest would take both the girls and the boys behind the altar. The second priest in their community only took the boys and made a point about that. And then the third priest took neither, because their point was neither has even been baptized. So they shouldn't be behind the altar if they haven't even been baptized yet. I thought that was really interesting. So, but that really struck how important it is that we need hierarchical vision here. And so that there is consistency across. And definite belief that any changes here really speak to a greater basic understanding of men and women in Orthodoxy, and that the language around that really permeates. And where things like a more feminist perspective can take a very negative connotation, right? And it's very much could be seen in culture as a power play. But even things like masculine can have different connotations, and neither align with Christ's vision of people. And that's where Orthodoxy needs to say, this is our view of gender in Orthodoxy, not in the greater secular society, but in Orthodoxy. Recognizing, though, that that will be groundbreaking, and it will shake the very foundation of some people's understanding of what Orthodoxy is and why they're a part of it, because it is so basic and it is so infused in everything we do. Finally, there was a question that we'd love, Father Stell, if you can help us understand, because we've had different experiences here, is the view of churching when the parents are not married and or are a mixed faith family. Is the churching still done the same regardless of the faith background of the parents? Hope I covered the highlights.
Very
Sure.
good.
So,
Thank
yeah, thank you, Eleni. So yes, if there are parents who are either not married or one happens to be non-Orthodox, then again, we would go into a variation, which today, since we only have one service, usually the language regarding for someone who is non-Orthodox, for the woman, um, she is just simply given the blessing, but no mention is made of her receiving Holy Communion in the church. If a couple is not married, the child should still be churched. The child is not responsible for the conditions or the reality of the parents. The child should not be by any means deprived of that blessing. And also, we have to remember too that the liturgical rites of the church, when done out of love and done out of in creative continuity with the past, also become opportunities for ministry, where a family that is not married, and when they see the beauty of God working and blessing the child, they then receive, and God works, mysteriously. We all know that, and He can very easily speak to the hearts of the couple, maybe to consider marrying in the future. So there is grounds for work to be done. I mean, there are opportunities, I should say, for God to work through the lives and the experiences of people, but under no circumstances should a child be denied the churching. And then the baptism. Now, of course, if you have two parents that may not be religious, they might just be Orthodox by name. Certainly, they would need to consent for the child to be baptized, and normally they will. It becomes more complicated when they don't, but that's where godparents also would be able to dialogue with the parents and again provide an opportunity for transformation and change. So anyway, that would be my answer to that. I don't know if that addressed the
Yes,
issue.
it does. It does. Good. Thank you. All right, Valerie, can you sum up briefly your group's comments and questions?
Several of the things are similar to what Barbara and Eleni's group had. I'm going to take a couple of the things that were in the end of the discussion and put them at the beginning because they actually kind of, circled back to the idea about the prayers themselves. One of those was about making the prayers more celebratory. One person suggested a special hymn that they were familiar with, for instance, in the Romanian church, a hymn that brought the comparison or alluded to Christ being carried in the arms of Simeon at his 40 days. Everybody seemed, not everybody, chimed in, but there seemed agreement about prayers for the father being important too, about the father sharing in the parenting of the child, that this is not just the mother's responsibility, but is equally the father's. Prayers also for the godparents, regarding helping in the spiritual formation of the child. And that brought up a couple of things. One person noted that godparents are rarely involved, not only in that service, but many times not very involved in the spiritual formation of the child. And then that brought up the idea about that there needs to be more care by the parents in choosing appropriate godparents and by the clergy in accepting and allowing those godparents and viewing them as acceptable. An interesting suggestion came up from one person about adapting and incorporating prayers from other traditions that would be really applicable. That, and Father Stowe mentioned that, yes, of course, if they are in the phronema of the church, the mindset of the church, then of course they would be acceptable. Another issue that was raised was the idea of having variations of prayers as appropriate for different circumstances. For instance, prayers to support mothers who may be single parents, prayers about the church supporting women who may have been victimized in some way, all those kinds of things. Then there was the issue of how do we move forward to update these prayers. And Father Stowe mentioned, hoping for open-minded bishops that, begin locally, bishops that will listen to women, that will be open to the suggestion and expertise of people within the St. Phoebe Center, that sort of thing. And then the bishop, of course, needing to bring this up with the synod of bishops, but that overall, this is a concerted effort that has to be done at every level of the church. Regarding bringing the child into the altar area, people agreed that consistency is important, the same for both sexes, either bringing them in or not bringing them in, but for both. It was noted that bringing them in resonates with a couple of things. One, with the idea of the priesthood of all believers, and the other with the psalm verse of I will enter into your house, which the priest repeats as he's bringing the child into the church. And one participant actually mentioned how emotional it was for her when her granddaughter was brought into the altar after she was raised, never seeing the female infants being brought into the altar area. Another issue that was raised was, might this also be done with older children and with adult catechumens? Maybe we could adapt the service for catechumens, because I don't think that we have a very standardized service for people, to officially become catechumens. Another person mentioned how emotional it was seeing the child return to his or her parents after the priest blessed the child. And there seemed general acceptance of reference for during the service with the whole congregation. And as Father Stell had suggested during his presentation before the Eucharist, as Barbara and Eleni's group also met, that, it doesn't make any difference for the infant, but yeah, waiting until after the end of the service excludes the mother from receiving the Eucharist for yet another week.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have one more group?
Yes.
Yes. There we go.
No, sorry, I didn't have my hand up.
No, Pamela,
Um,
please.
Sure. Again, I'm going to summarize because most of our comments have already been echoed. But I think what was important was the single mother. Somebody brought up about how you would address a single mother versus a married couple, and Father addressed that. But that was something that I saw as a big concern out of our group. And another issue was it's more of a healing service. And I never really thought of that before as it was presented. So I think that's important that it's healing for the child, the mother, the father, and the godparents. We also believe that the prayer should be adapted for the entire family of the parents and the godparents. And we also agreed that with Father Snell that the child should come in one door and exit out the other door. That's important for both sex, that the child go through the altar the same way. And then finally, to summarize, whether it should be public or private, we had a bit of a disagreement, but we really saw the same point of view where it should be a public celebration unless the priest felt necessary to go ahead and keep it private for the family or for the mother. And I think that was something important to bring up too.
Good.
But otherwise, most of our comments were all the same.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you all for your good note taking and the participation. It's just been wonderful. And we want to thank Father Still for his work on this terrific presentation. So let's wrap this up. I want to remind you that we have a few more of these, and if you miss them, as I mentioned earlier, they're on our website. So please look these up if you missed any of the prior. Next Tuesday night, we will be talking about miscarriage and death and stillbirth. Please make time for that, 7:30 next week. So as we end every evening in prayer, Barbara, if you can pull up our prayer so we can take a moment and pray together, and then we will go our way. Oh, all merciful God, thank you for bringing us together this evening in your name. Bless our work, grant to our hierarchs wisdom, strength, courage, and compassion as they discern the many calls for the revival of the ordained female diaconate. May they be guided by the grace of your Holy Spirit. May the spirit of unity and love inspire them to consider how the revival of this ancient order can help in the upbuilding of the entire church today. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
No. So I can
So
take.
we hope to see you all next Tuesday. God bless and good night.
Good night.
I know. Is that to make me